We'll now quickly move on to Heather Kirkwood in the US. Heather is a wonderful, wonderful lawyer who gives all her time to hundreds of families caught up in child protective cases. She has built up a mighty network of defense attorneys, forensics experts, and other specialists all over the US, UK, and Europe. I traced her out after reading an article by her 10 years ago when looking for help in the US, when I was contacted by the first Indian family there with a taken baby. The case was of a pattern that I later saw occurring over and over again. The father is a software engineer, newly arrived with his family to the States. Typically, there are new parents, and the child was taken away when they go to hospital with some injury the child has suffered accidentally. They're immediately accused by the hospital of causing the injury themselves. It's called shaken baby syndrome, a very flawed medical theory that Heather will speak to you about. Heather helps in all these cases for free. She goes out of her way, not just to give legal advice, but to comfort and give hope to these Indian families. She's available at dinner parties, at conferences elsewhere, and even recently on holiday in Vietnam. Heather deserves an award from the government of India for her help to Indian families in the US. And one day, I hope she will get it. Heather, on to you.
All right. So this was a talk that I gave in 2016 to the Florida Association of Death Penalty Attorneys. And the difference in these cases from many other cases is that generally speaking, you have a murder and the question is who did it, or a child died and they say it's a murder and the question is who did it. But these cases are different because in these cases, they're not just making a murderer. This was a popular Netflix type show of how they created evidence that was false or misleading to convict. Well, it wasn't apparent in that case, but of a murder. But what they do here is that they create the crime. They create the murder. So very, very different. These were some of the people who were accused of murder, which were my initial cases, Christian Asplin, Tavarius Radford. But what's most important here, all kinds of people, all kinds of families. But in every single case, there was either a natural medical cause or an accidental injury. Adrian Thomas on sepsis, Roman and Lynette Finnegan, the child had a heart condition, a prescription error, and the skull fracture was created at autopsy, as a forensic pathologist eventually admitted. Rishi Ramguli, a Cornell graduate, he had nothing to do with the original injuries. Connie Riken, virtually a saint, most wonderful daycare person in the world. Again, that was a fall some days earlier. That's Ernie, whom I just spoke about. The baby died of pneumonia and a coagulopathy. It had been a sick baby from birth. The two Boston nanny cases, I'm not going to go through those, but the medical evidence is really quite clear in these cases that these are not murders. They aren't even assaults. Some of them are shortfalls, most are natural. So that's where I'm coming from. When I looked at the first case about 10 years ago, I think it's longer than that now, maybe that should be 20. My son looked at it. He was at Oxford at the time. I asked him to give me the research basis for shaken baby syndrome. He came back after 3 months and he said, there is no research basis for shaken baby syndrome. And I thought, oh my gosh, $100,000 in an Oxford education, you can't find the research basis for shaken baby syndrome. That has since been confirmed by a 2016 report out of the basically Karolinska Institute, sponsored by the Swedish government, which found no reliable evidentiary basis for shaken baby syndrome. So we know that now. I was very struck by one panelist who said that they know that there's a lot of information. They know it's wrong, but they continue to repeat it. That moves to me into the fraud area. I did securities fraud. If this was a securities case, this would be fraud. You'd go to prison for saying it, but it's still happening. Yet doctors are continuing to testify that they can diagnose based on various internal distinctions, hundreds of thousands of cases each year. So I think I'm probably already used up much of my time. So I'm just going to introduce the families. I'm going to do two. I'm going to do this algorithm. This is the algorithm that is taught in medical schools and applied routinely by doctors. You can see if they have a skull fracture and oh, sorry, I went back. How do I go back in? It's used always. And when you look at the injury type, these are mostly internal injuries. And when you look at some of them, like intradural hemorrhage or subdural subarachnoid, we now know that 40% of babies have that asymptomatic newborn babies. But when you look at the lines, there is no place on here that leads you to innocence. You can be presumptive for inflicted injury or suspicious for inflicted injury. That's as far as you get. The algorithm never gives you no injury or no inflicted injury. Same on bones. Forces are wrong. We know this. And I'm just going to, this is the type of work I do, which I often do in my presentations. I go through the various slides and so on to show what you have to do. Talk about overworked attorneys. These are mostly public defenders, assigned counsel. They don't have time to do this. They don't have time to learn the slides, have them reviewed. They don't have time. So lots of natural cases, lots of shortfall cases. And I'm going to take you all the way down here. Here's something that has changed. When I first did this, it was mostly with dead babies, accusations of murder, people in prison for life. We still have some on death row. What I'm seeing now are well babies, perfectly well babies, babies who develop normally. That was true in the cases involving Indians that Saranya was discussing. The only difference with those cases is that there are slightly more previous injuries from falls in India. India seems to have harder surfaces on some of the floors, stone floors. And so they come with a pre-existing skull fracture, a pre-existing subdural. They have another small rebleed, again from a fall, and off you go down the abuse end. So that's the only difference I've noted. Mostly sick babies, household accidents, over and over. So here are the people. Once you go through the evidence, what did the child actually die of? And these aren't all death cases. Most of these ones happen to be because they were early cases. But you see there's a warfarin overdose, there's childhood stroke, there's pneumonia, there's birth trauma, there's even pancreatitis abdominal injury. It's a whole array of the things from which people die. And so I just wanted to introduce a couple of the families. These are the Asplins, shortfall with misintubation and thrombosis. That's the older child who did not die. That's the one who did die, the baby. They have since had 3 children. They didn't intend to have 3 children. They were IVF, turned out to be triplets. They were quite shocked. So there are wonderful, wonderful pictures of them with all 4 children now. The Finnegans, this was a 14-year-old who died. They said they had killed her. There was a prescription error that I found in approximately within a day of looking at the case. Triple dose of warfarin, for those of you who know what warfarin is. She'd had open heart surgery 3 times, and there was a skull fracture, and it was very clearly created at autopsy because the pre-autopsy photos didn't have a skull fracture. So we knew that. So this is a case where they were reunited. Tremendous harm to the family, absolutely tremendous harm. PTSD, talk about PTSD. These people have PTSD far beyond that, which is often found after seeing bombs explode in Afghanistan. And I'm not making light of that. I'm just giving some comparative. Felix's wonderful, wonderful story. These were adopted children who the mother was a prostitute. They adopted the first child. Then she said the second child was available. They adopted that child. They were accused. They're both medical professionals. She was an ICU nurse, and he was a physician's assistant. Wonderful careers. Finally got that dismissed in family court. Took forever. But didn't take that long, relatively speaking, maybe a year or 2. And I got a Christmas card. They had 6 children in. They'd adopted 4 more children after that. Herrera's vitamin D rickets. Swedish report should have changed the world, but it didn't. It found that there was no reliable basis for shaken baby syndrome. One would think that would stop everything. I do think the cases in Sweden have gone down. Norway is on the fringe. Norway is right on the cusp. It's headed that way. It's not there yet. These were other just miscellaneous cases that I've had since in more recent years. Childhood stroke, adopted children with chronic disease, Liebig, abdominal injury infection preceding the period. It was testified there were 20 whip marks. There were no whip marks. He was in DIC and lying on IV tubes. Recently granted a certificate of innocence. Bradford, this was a nurse. Devilbot, there was a lack of brain development. Now, I don't find that in a lot of doctors here, and that a lot of doctors being accused, they're just the most likely to find somebody, I think. So that's where I find the real disparity. I don't find as much of an ethnicity difference. If they find these findings, they claim abuse, and it doesn't matter who you are. I've got white doctors, I've got people on welfare, I've got people who had criminal records, had come out of prison, and it's all the same. Now, when I do the case, Liebig was one where he had a prison, well, Emil had a prison record. Liebig didn't have, but he had a long history of drug use, including on that day. It just didn't happen under his case. So everybody. The difference, I think, is that people with more money can pay for better legal defenses, but it doesn't always get them anywhere, because you can get a very expensive lawyer who isn't willing to look at the autopsy slides and the autopsy photos, or isn't able to. So it doesn't always get you there. So I'm kind of mixed on that as to how much of a role ethnicity plays. It's kind of an equal opportunity accusations. We've had pretty much everybody. So I'm saying, what do these cases have in common? All of them. What they have in common, including Mrs. Chatterjee, is that parents or caretakers were, typo there, were falsely accused of abuse, and the children were taken based on false, inaccurate, even fraudulent claims. In some cases, they were in prison. At least 2 are still on death row. So this is dead serious. The harm to the children, the taking of the children, I'm seeing that increasingly in well children. Perfectly, absolutely well children. They used to have to be dead. They don't have to be dead anymore. They can be perfectly well taken in for a routine medical issue and find themselves accused. So that's takeaways. It can happen to anyone. The claims are articles of faith rather than precepts of science. That's from a well-known federal court case in which I was involved. Often more accurate to say the claims are imaginary. They result in the worldwide destruction of families, and it's not just Norway. So also the US, Canada, Australia, Germany, France, the UK, even Japan. So that's where we are. Great progress made. Sometimes we slide backwards. Extremely interesting from a medical perspective. And I'm going to turn this over to Ted Harriton, for whom I had searched for years because I have a death penalty case that I want him to look at. Thank you.